Yes, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our friends, our colleagues, our artivists, and as Frederick Douglass says, our agitators across the world. We are in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We are in Lancaster, PA, in Chester, and in Rhode Island, and across the world to Dublin, Ireland. Uh, this is the fifth of our Live and Learn series. For those of you who just joined us, it is the old folkloric term that your grandmother used to say, well, child, live and learn. The series is dedicated to the brilliant Dr. Joseph Kelly of the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, who was concerned with literacy and visual literacy. And we dedicate this year's series to him. Next slide, please. So everyone knows that tomorrow, everyone becomes Irish for 24 hours. And today we want to explore the day before and the day after St. Patrick's Day. And next slide, please. And explore a bit, what does St. Patrick's Day really mean? We know we have the biblical, the oracle, and the religious reference to St. Patrick's. We all know about the parades, but how do we celebrate St. Patrick's Day? How do we cultivate an understanding of cultural sensitivity, cultural inclusion, cultural specificity at St. Patrick's Day? Next slide, please. Well, in 1984, the University of Virginia and the Thomas Jefferson Center held a landmark international gathering called Reimagining Ireland. And they brought scholars, humanists, artists, entertainers, politicians from across the world to ask the question, who gets to call themselves Irish? Is it the 4 million people who live in Ireland, or 5 million people now who live in Ireland? Or is it the 40 million people plus across the world who embrace a Gaelic culture while they exalt and celebrate their own indigenous culture? And so I wonder, as I wander across the world, the Afro-Gaelic world, just who claims, who names, and who has the right to call themselves Irish. We know that in the abolitionist period in the United States, freemen, indentured servants, and enslaved people alike chose Mexico as the third route, a route to go and seek their freedom. And we know that Mexico today, as in tomorrow, March 17th, will honor African Americans and freemen and Irish who served during the Mexican War. We also know that 1/3 of the names in Barbados are Irish names, and African and Irishmen have gathered both in retreat, in refuge, and in together in solidarity. And so this T-shirt, which will be worn tomorrow, made in Barbados with Irish parts, kind of exemplifies the ownership of Afro-Gaelic culture in Barbados. The islands also include Cuba, who will have a St. Patrick's Day parade tomorrow. And I love this Cuban blood and Irish blood alcohol. Well, we're going to hope that that's about pouring libations and smoking cigars and also singing to the Santerias too. We find parades tomorrow in Puerto Rico. And we find both children's games and revolutionaries solidarity celebrated tomorrow. We also know that in uh, Montserrat tomorrow, there will be perhaps one of the largest parades, uh, third only, well, fourth, Ireland, of course, New York City, Sydney, Australia, and Montserrat parades. And people of all generations will remember, recall, and celebrate. We know that the African Egungun spirits and the Junkanus will come out tomorrow, and they'll meet the Straw Boys and the Wren Boys in the streets, and they too will celebrate. We also know that St. Patrick's Day in Montserrat is a day of revolution, because as the Irish were celebrating and drinking on St. Patrick's Day, enslaved people revolted. And so it's considered also a day of liberation and a day of revolution. If you look into these slides, you see the Straw Boy, the Wren Boy, the Junkanu, the Egungun spirit. In fact, here in America, 38%, according to Harvard University study on Ebonics, 38% of African Americans have at least one Irish ancestor. That doesn't mean that 38% are trying to become Irish tomorrow, but they are embracing the crossroads between the transatlantic slave trade experience and the famine Irish period that put us into melting pot. I hate that term. I prefer to use cultural gumbo, and also at the edges of society. We know that there's the amalgamation that brought Irish men and African American women together because of the sheer life expectancy. And so I say at this point always, sisters and brothers and cousins, we are going to explore what we see in each other. I've chosen, and what we do not see in each other. I've chosen to begin with Irish men in blackface, because during the famine years and afterwards, an Irishman in America could elevate himself by becoming a blackface performer of American music and culture. Our program in Harrisburg has placed a monument, Kim, on the space of the old 8th Ward, a neighborhood where 1,100 Black families and 1,500 Irish families shared a common ground until the turn of the 20th century, where their neighborhood was removed because of eminent domain. Every brick, every mortar, every pebble, every cornice was removed and sold to build the Capitol's 12 buildings. When we looked at some of the photographs and of the period before it was torn down, we began to notice that John Vogel's minstrels were performing in Harrisburg at the foot of the African American and Irish community at the site that was an Underground Railroad site. And I had to ask myself, Dedria, why now did the minstrels come to the center of Pennsylvania and to the Capitol above the Mason-Dixon line just at the period? Well, Vogel purchased Algie Field's Minstrel Company, and he brought that company to Harrisburg on an East-West Pennsylvania tour. Two schools of thought. At the beginning of the century, it was Irishmen in blackface mirroring or echoing or mimicking. And at the end of that century, it was mockery. If we were to stop today or now and you had to leave, I'd ask you to read these two books, The Slave Ship and The Coffin Ship, because if you combine the struggle and the strife of these two people and the condition that their middle passage, what is common to me, Miriam, in both books is that they talk about a new people being born in the middle of the ship, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, not quite the people who left, but not the people who would welcome them, and I use that word euphemistically. We talk about how in the bows of those ships, when they left everything behind, what they brought in their DNA and in their memory were their songs and their stories, and how those songs and those stories would work together or not in the struggle in the marketplace as the two were set upon each other for land, for jobs, and for status. We also talk about myth and miracle, religion and magic in both cultures, the notion of the clown and the fool and his place in both Irish culture and African culture as the trickster who spoke in many tongues with many messages, and how these two cultures met each other on the rail, in the trail, in the canal, in the field, in the mine, and how each created a kind of character. The first character to be seen in blackface was actually this Sambo. And I need to tell you again, if you're leaving me right now, that Sambo was a term of honor from tribes. Sambo was the person who stepped outside of the play or the story to speak to the audience about what was really going on and to pass down an oral history. Sambo begins to emerge in the hedge school and in the African wood plains where reading was taught primarily to the Bible, and the religious stories became secular stories as the dances were shared in the marketplace. The jig and the jump, the fiddle and the banjo, the bones and the tambourine or baron began to be swapped and amalgamated and merged in cross music. The Chanus, the dance before the Irish competition, which we will see tomorrow, was a Chanus dance, which was done loosely and freely with joints, with arms akimbo, with legs in the parallel. And we see these broom dances of the Irish being crossed with Caribbean and Southern and even Northern America. The biggest crossover, of course, is the banjo, an African instrument, which becomes a primary instrument in Irish music, and the fiddle, a European instrument, which becomes a primary instrument in early mountain music, folk music, ragtime music, and jazz. Tambo, bones, fiddle, and become the instruments that begin to form this institution called the minstrel show. And these Ethiopian delineators who follow the antics, the mores, and the folkways of African Americans came down to us through other ethnic origins also. On the top left of my screen is Balthazar. Those of you who follow the nativity know that Balthazar was the Moorish. The Moor came from Shakespeare's theater, and we all know Othello, the Moor. We all know that it was the first appearance of white men in blackface to visit the colonies. But this is a complete chalking of the face. This is not a mockery face, but an attempt to emulate. And I need to ask you to look deeply to your left is Sir Laurence Olivier, a white actor in blackface. To your far right is Keith David, a black man who, in order to play in Shakespeare, had to blacken his face when he played Othello the first time. He could not appear in his own skin. This Prince of Morocco is going to get the Premier of Canada into a little trouble. But again, the Prince of Morocco is a character that comes out of Shakespeare's Merchant in Venice, who courts her by saying, "Mislike me not for my complexion." An English and Irishman named Charles Dibdin brought a dramatic character called Mongo to the American colonies. And Mongo was a character who lamented that that he did the work while his master played, and he deserved the freedom. Mongo was performed first by Black men, but still in blackface, at the African Grove Theater. And Ira Aldridge, the great Ira Aldridge, who toured Ireland and was a success there, performed one of his first roles as Mongo. And he sang his lament: "Dear hearts, what a terrible life I've led. A dog has it better that is sheltered and fed. Night and day it is the same. My pain is their gain. He wished me, Lord, he was dead." Ira Aldridge won the hearts of Americans and New Yorkers, and he played many of the great roles of Shakespeare, the Prince of Morocco, Lear, Othello, but he played them in blackface. The height of the African Grove period was 1838. The African Grove was burned down by Irish mobs after 1838 because these freedmen dared to portray high. Well, that 1838 period is also a period when Pennsylvania changed its constitution. Until 1838, Black men could vote in Pennsylvania, but the Constitution of Pennsylvania was changed, and it took until 1870 and the 15th Amendment for Black men to regain the right to vote. 1838 is the first record of a performance of a white Irishman in blackface performing the character of Jim Crow, which was a dance. Wheel about and turn about and jump just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. T.D. Rice's performance of Jim Crow had nothing to do with African Americans. It was only a dance borrowed that was done in blackface. As you can see, the pants come from European clowns. The costume is the patchwork costume that looks more like Mark Twain than African American. His rival, George Washington Dixon, brought to the stage the character of Zip Coon, the urban improvisation of the freedman who has crossed the Mason-Dixon line. It was a time of the transcendentalists holding salons, lyceums, and forums to discuss could America really be free unless it freed the enslaved. And men like Emerson and Thoreau and William Howard Day, who had studied at Oberlin College with John Brown, began to invite Frederick Douglass to speak at these. I forgot to say, 1838 was also the year that Frederick Douglass finally won his freedom and escaped on the Underground Railroad. So 1838 is an important year. It's also the year that Dan Emmett, who wrote the song Dixie, began to appear on the stage and mock Emerson, Thoreau, Daniel O'Connell, Douglass, and all the other great orators with what were called these comic stump speeches. The stump speeches would be done by the banjo player and the tambourine player, the Jim Crow and the Zip Coon, the darky and the dandy, and they began to form a style of touring musical theater. They called themselves the Virginia Minstrels. had nothing to do with Virginia. But we can begin to see that uh, face of uh, the face of the delineator, which is to cover yourself completely in black, is beginning to change into the mask of the minstrel, which is to leave your mouth ring, to exaggerate your clothes, from the gentleman in the sack suit on the left to a wild and crazy, exaggerated urban character. Why? Because the 1830 and 1840 census began to count the freemen and freedmen in those important census years, and they began to challenge. Well, P.T. Barnum loved a good challenge, and he knew that he could make $1 off of that challenge. He took the song of an Austrian singer, Jenny Lind. He put it with the music of Stephen Foster, and he had minstrels portray these women on the American stage. And again, there's no women. These are Irish men in blackface portraying Irish, Austrian, French singers. Meanwhile, back in the 5th District at the Five Corners, a kind of a battle began to occur between Herman Melville, who supported the English actor Charles Macready, and the other Bowery boys, who supported an American Shakespeare actor. Washington Irving wrote an article saying, are we going to allow the American stage to be taken over by Irishmen in blackface portraying rowdies, darkies, and dandies? Well, the actors who were in the theater when it was burned down said yes. But the Melville and the intellectuals said no. And so for 11 days, there was theater battles in New York City, the first civil war in America where police are fighting civilians, is really this war over what image would emerge on the American stage. The winner was the blackface minstrel, and he emerged and maintained the stage for another 100 years. So memory, mockery, and mime were the first 3 ingredients in this minstrel madness and this blackface institution, which has taken over America. Next slide, please. I spoke of the notion of mimicry and mockery, and because this is not only St. Patrick's Day tomorrow, but Women's Month, I wanted to also share with you these great women who were appearing on the American stage: Lola Montez, the Crabtree, and all the abolitionist women who were rising out of major cities. You'll perhaps recognize Frances Harper there, or Ida B. Wells, certainly Sojourner Truth, Mrs. Forden, Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, who was called the Black Swan because she sang so beautifully, Lydia Hamilton Smith, who managed Thaddeus Stevens' entire estate, and Harriet Fortin, who was the wife of James Fortin. Well, the minstrels didn't let up on the ladies either, Dedria. They took on those great African-American women. And now you had Irish men playing Black men, playing Black women or Spanish women, and truth is not a part of this. Here we have Fanny Ellsler, a famous dancer. George Christie takes on her costume in blackface, portrays the Irishman, portraying the Austrian dancer doing a Spanish dance. But two women begin to emerge, two dark women begin to emerge on the American stage, the wench and the Nubian. The wench who is still enslaved and the Nubian who is freed, but requires what is called plissage. This gentleman's name is Francis Leon. He was a female impersonator, and he dressed as an octoroon and introduced the latest fashion and the highest fashions of the day. And this is George Kirkland, who brought the role of the mammy and the mulatto, or the quadroon, darker than the octoroon, darker than the place blanc, and we begin to get the emergence of Mammy and Dinah. The octoroon system of plissage was to place a woman who was 1/8 Black in the protection of a white gentleman who had two families, one for his privilege and one for his delight. These families that were for delight usually gave him the sons and daughters who inherited their money, and the Healy families, which we are spending a great deal of time talking about, were part of these women. They were so well respected, these octoroons, that the minstrels wrote a song about them, Miriam, called The Yellow Rose of Texas. And I delight when I hear people in Texas sing The Yellow Rose of Texas at football games, because they do not know that they are singing about an octoroon woman. This is Jemima, and we all know the demise of a brilliant biblical character. Jemima means dove in Hebrew, and Jemima in the Old Testament is the daughter of Job. Also, we know Dinah through the book of Genesis and the rape of Dinah, whose father sent sons to recover her. But she has come down to us as a diminished character, oversized, rural, meek and mild woman who also not only in her size diminishes womanhood, but always is portrayed as diminishing her man. This character appears in Irish culture, and Irish character out of blackface too. This slide should say 1830 and 1840 census. It is in those census that I'd like you to turn to this book, How the Irish Became White, because it is in those census that they move from being other to being classified as white. This gentleman's name is William Henry Lane. He won the title of Master Juba for dancing a Juba contest in Madison Square Garden against the leading Irish dancers of the day. Born a freeman in Providence, Rhode Island, won his contest dance at Madison Square Garden against Master Diamond, the leading dancer of the Astor plays, and he was allowed to go forward. Next slide, please. And P.T. Barnum toured him toward Juba, across England and Ireland, in illustrated tours. Juba died a poor man, and once he had to perform Frederick in blackface, and so here was a Black man playing an Irish man, playing a Black man, doing a jig and a dance, and all sense of reality is lost to this audience. Juba exposed himself as a Black man and took his makeup off and began to perform the songs of Stephen Foster, because he found in those songs a sense of pathos. Old Susanna, a song about escaping into the wilderness. The the issues of race, class, and culture begin to collide as America begins to weigh out the value of a Black man versus the value of an Irishman. The Irishman begins to feel that while the Black man seeks rights, he has no rights at all. And he begins to take, rather than songs and jokes, rather than songs and dances, he begins to take opinions through jokes and skits about the vast diversity of voices that are heard in the abolitionist movement and in the colored conventions. And so the minstrel show moves from music and dance to mockery and skit of the speeches of these really brilliant men. I might say that Robert Purvis, who was on the far left, was the president of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. And yes, he was a Black man. When the minstrels went to war, when the country realized that it needed to embrace Black soldiers after the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation and the United States colored troops came into being, 180,000 freedmen, and contraband joined the army. There was a great dilemma about their representation. This man, his name is David Bustle Bowser. He started his career by creating fire hats for volunteer fire departments, but he was commissioned by the Henry Highland Garnet Society to create the flags for the 127 regiments. And they used Greek women's images on the flags. Many Confederates believed that they were fighting for the right to marry white women. Others felt fear of the fact that they would put a gun in a Black man's hand. And so the minstrels took on yet another villain in their mind, which was an armed Black man. And they began to buffoon these Black men. If you noticed the picture earlier, William Carey was the first Black man to win the Medal of Honor for carrying the flag, and he becomes a target by the minstrel period. Also, the sounds of the rural South were disappearing, and new sounds emerged that the minstrels would literally steal. The Middle European sounds, the New England sounds, the Fisk Jubilee sounds were all built into large choirs, bands, and dancers on the stage. And the shows became more about spectacle than about any attempt at mirroring any folk culture. Black men come to the American stage, but again, Black men must perform in minstrel shows in blackface. The Sam Lucas, a brilliant looking gentleman, and Billy Kersans darkened themselves. They attempted to use the full Black, as they referred to it, as opposed to the masked Black. And they attempted to write songs with hidden messages. Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, which James Bland wrote, which is the state song for Virginia, really talked about the disillusionment of people, not about going back to the master, but about going back to land as opposed to cobblestone urban streets. Black Patty, the first Black woman to own her own minstrel company. In that company was Josephine Baker. In the company also was a dancer by the name of Ernest Hogan, a songwriter who brought more ragtime songs to us than probably any other African-American writer of his time. But he still had to take on, his name is Reuben Crowder, Dedria. He comes from St. Louis, but when he came to New York, he had to have an Irish name. So he comes to New York at the time of Plessy versus Ferguson, and he decides that he's going to change his name to Ernest Hogan, because when he performs in blackface, no one will know that he's Black anyway. So a Black man takes an Irish name to perform as a Black man that made songs and he creates three very damaging songs. Coon, Coon, Coon. These songs were printed, Kimberly, in the Sunday newspapers of every major newspaper across the country. If you bought the Sunday paper, you would get these piano songs. Coon, 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 that talked about enameling your face. Nigga, I Never Loved You No How, which is the title of the song, forgive me for using the N-word, and All Coons Look Alike to Me. These songs are then taken up by the Williams and Walker production company. And Bert Williams and George Walker come to Harrisburg as the old 8th Ward is being torn down. And they perform on one corner in the theater as genuine Black men doing blackface, while Lou Dockstaedtler and Algie Fields perform on the corner that is across the street from our monument. Lou Dockstaedtler writes his seminal song, St. Patrick's Day is a Bad Day for a Coon. And this song sells over 6,000 copies in central Pennsylvania. People are singing the song on St. Patrick's Day for a decade afterwards. The chorus of the song, Miriam says that on St. Patrick's Day, you should go out and find a Black man and paint him green. So we have three minstrel companies performing. A Black company that calls themselves Genuine, a Dockstaedtler company calls themselves Original, and the John Vogel company across the street from where our monument to the Black vote is, calling themselves Authentic. The citizens of the old 8th Ward do not know whether the Genuine are legitimate, the legitimate are authentic, the authentic are genuine. Next slide, please. And because of the vernacular, they don't know whether which company is Black and which company is white underneath the makeup. Next slide, please. We're wrapping up. Here's my heart goes out to Egbert Austin Williams, Bert Williams, a light-skinned man from Antigua who makes $6,500 a week at the height of the minstrels of the Ziegfeld Follies, but has to do it by playing a Black rooster about to lose his head. When in fact, he was an antagonist of Birth of a Nation, and he spoke when he was out of blackface about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment at a time when Woodrow Wilson is about to come to the White House. And Woodrow Wilson is touring Pennsylvania to lower votes. We're almost there, friends. Next one, please. On the year that the capital of Pennsylvania puts up white only and colored only signs, is the year that Woodrow Wilson segregates the White House. These organizations, these Black organizations, began to establish benevolent societies and burial societies where men in blackface would give benefits, minstrel show benefits, to raise money for Black causes. Their causes included Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching cause and Philip A. Randolph's Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porter causes. And so while Bert Williams said, while they are laughing at me in blackface, I am taking their money to support these causes. The word is that the vote is not in. But I do have to tell you that Harrisburg's aristocracy picked up this notion of giving minstrel shows for benefit causes. And after this year, next slide, please, this film also begins to project and promote the idea that it is all right to bring back a third time, Kim, this notion of blackface being in classic. This Shirley Temple, Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland, Fred Astaire. Here in central Pennsylvania, a guide is put out, published in Chicago and sent across the country, of how aristocrats can put on minstrel shows. And in Harrisburg, the top 5 gentlemen clubs on both sides of the river begin to use the annual minstrel show as their fundraising for social causes, including the City Beautiful cause, which is part of the reason why that whole neighborhood. Those of you who are familiar with the area will see that firemen in Lemoyne and across the Susquehanna River did annual shows. Ministers did annual shows. High schools did annual shows. The shows mostly mocked the Black intelligentsia and mostly mocked the rising Harlem heyday leaders of our time. I love this picture of Catherine Dunham. And into our own film and television memories came this notion of blackface. I can remember this Bugs Bunny blackface cartoon being an after-school hit. This picture is also the entire Stilton Steel Mill employees giving an annual blackface show until the 60s. From the 70s to the present, every 5 years is a story about someone making the mistake of blacking up, while organizations like the African American and Irish Diaspora Network, AIDN, next slide, please. Next slide, please. While those organizations are providing commemoratives and honorariums for those who were both Black and Irish, but have found a way to amalgamate instead of miscegenate their full identity, while new artists and new actors and new musicians are beginning to claim genealogy and identity and still identify as whole beings and not half or hyphenated beings. While that is going on, while every other commercial on the television has mixed race families and mixed race children, we are still fighting to figure out where this mimicry and mockery, young rappers have asked me the question, does it matter anymore? I leave that question to you and to the ladies who are going to take up the next conversation. But race matters. And we have brilliant and not so brilliant people who have made the mistake here. Trudeau says he was just being that Prince of Morocco. You know, he wasn't trying to be a minstrel. He was trying to be a. But at the same time, we have our Philadelphia mummers still defending the tradition, and we have segregationists and divisionaries posing the questions again about race, culture, skin tone. So my time is up, and I thank you for allowing me to go over, but here is a picture of Venus and her sister. Here's a New York fashion after Al Jolson. Here's a young white child who wants to be a Black basketball player. Here's Katy Perry selling, next slide, please, $800 high heel shoes that look like minstrel shows. So you tell me how we scrub this blackface off our American identity. You tell me how we negotiate, navigate this whole notion of race, culture, skin tone, and identity. I pose some questions and I turn them over to some deeper thinkers than myself. And that are my colleagues, my friends, my collaborators, and my sisters who will talk to you, share with you their work in this conversation and their idea about Black and White and Green at St. Patrick's Day, especially against the landscape of Women's Month. Thank you. Miriam?
Well done, Lenny. Thank you. I never fail to learn something from you, and anytime I have the honor of sharing a space with you, even if it's this little box on a computer tonight, it's such an honor and a pleasure. And thank you for everything that you've done over many decades to interrogate this space. You've been plowing the fields, to use that metaphor, for a long time. And I know I speak for myself, Kim, Dedria, and Grace by saying how delighted we are to have been invited to participate with you this evening and to follow on from that wonderful setup. As Lenny mentioned, my name is Miriam Nyhan Gray, and I have the great pleasure and honor of being on the board of the African American Irish Diaspora Network. With Lenny, he referenced it there in his chat earlier, in his talk earlier. And I'm on that board with my colleague, Kimberly DaCosta at NYU. And maybe I'm going to hand over, maybe do some brief introductions, Lenny,
Yes,
is what you
Yes, would you each take about 5 minutes to talk about your work? And
oh yeah, okay, you want me to talk about mine first?
Yeah, would you talk about Gluckman and your incredible series?
I will indeed. Yeah, thanks for that, Lenny. So I'm a historian based at New York University, and this is not a Brooklyn accent or a New York accent. I'm originally from Ireland. I've had the great pleasure of living in the United States since 2006, actually. I'm interested in the nexus of where race and ethnicity come together in terms of the immigrant experience. And I'm interested in comparative history in terms of looking at different geographic spaces, different groups, et cetera, But over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, I became more and more interested in the profile of Irish America and how we present it. I'm a co-director of the Archives of Irish America at New York University, and I've conducted about 1/3 of the interviews that are housed in the Glucksman Ireland House collection. So that's maybe somewhere between 100 and 150 interviews or more. And over the last few years, I looked at the collection, and it's limited. It's a wonderfully rich collection in that it captures the voices of people who self-identify as being Irish and American, or Irish American, and everything in between those usages, meaning from immigrant born to people who are 6 or 7 generations in the United States. And it's limited because it's in New York City, and because we're drawing on the New York City demographic, meaning it's predominantly, you're talking of people of Roman Catholic background, for example. We don't have many Scots-Irish voices in the collection, for example, because we're in New York City. It's mainly capturing demographically people who descended from the famine or afterwards. Okay, so there's a chronological kind of limitation as well. But more than that, I began to think, as the parent of biracial children, one of the things I kind of say this kind of half joking, half in earnest, isn't that the phrase? In 50 years' time, when my sons look in the collection of the Archives of Irish America, they would remark that their mother hadn't interviewed anyone who looked like them, okay? And it made me think about the changes in Ireland, in that in today's Ireland, we cannot assume that people will phenotypically look like me, okay? And that was really the impetus in terms of saying, how do we reflect a more diverse Irish New York even? And it brought to kind of deeper thinking about the spaces of Irishness in the tri-state area and more generally. And a lot of what I could describe is not particular to the Irish case, although there are particularities about the intersection or interaction of Irishness and African-American history, some of which Lenny so richly touched on there earlier. They could be applied though to other white ethnic groups. But I was particularly interested in the Irish case. So what we undertook a project essentially to go out and find people who reflected the diversity of Irish America, of being American and of Irish descent, and everything that that could mean, not just quite a limited pool. So that kind of, on one level, you know, when I say that to people, sometimes they're like, oh, sure, that should have been easy in New York City. It wasn't, and it isn't. It's reaching into community or reaching out to individuals who are not, like, if you said to me, Miriam, I want you to go out tomorrow and interview 5 Irish Americans, I can go to Irish spaces and find those people really quickly. But one of the reasons the African American Irish Diaspora Network is important is that it's some kind of gathering mechanism by which people who reflect, frankly, the Ireland of today as well, to some extent, can be brought together. And so that all, fast forward, that ended up in the Black, Brown and Green Voices project, which is a modest oral history project to capture some of that diversity, but has been such rewarding work, notwithstanding the pandemic, notwithstanding, or maybe fueled and enhanced, ironically and sadly in some ways, because of the history that we've been experiencing, in particular around conversations of race in the United States, but also in Ireland and globally. So we had to do things like pivot from face-to-face interviews to online interviews, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really humbled that the 4 people here that I know on this webinar this evening, Lenny, Kim, Dedria and Grace, were all so generous with their time and spirit to contribute to this collection. It's a modest amount of interviews. It was basically a test run to see. Our goal is to expand this because the yield from the interviews themselves are rich, but more importantly, and I'd engaged a lot with Irish communities in New York and in London, and that sense of contributing to community was familiar to me, but not in the way that this work is actually really actively creating community in really dynamic ways. And it's been a learning curve for me, and you know what I bring to the table in terms of my profile and my privilege, and I think for us all in the different ways that we have, you know, I know it's really hackneyed, and it's like, you know, I used to use the term to give voice, but that takes away agency from people to bear witness and to document, to be the person who's turning on that recorder, allowing people to feel part of a community, or to feel some kind of connection with community that didn't exist in the past. I hope I'm not overstating it. And actually Lenny and Kim and Dedria and Grace know me all well enough now to correct me when they come on if they feel that I do. But that's what I've been basically doing. I think, Lenny, that's a fairly good overview of what's been keeping me busy. And with that, I will hand over I'll go to Kim first, my wonderful colleague at NYU, Professor Kim DaCosta. Kim, would you mind taking the floor virtually?
Sure. Thanks, Miriam. And thank you, Lenny, for that really, really rich talk. Okay, so I'm here in large part because of Miriam, who approached me. We're colleagues at NYU, but hadn't met before. She approached me to be part of the Black, Brown, and Green series. She had read my book. My work is about, generally speaking, how concepts of race get remade in institutional contexts. And in particular, I've been interested in questions about mixedness in the United States, which, has looked different in different places and different times for a variety of reasons. As part of that work, but also in relationship to what Miriam's been up to, and the other kinds of work that I do, I'm very interested in how it is that, this transnational dialogue about Blackness and Irishness is beginning to allow us to speak about and uncover things in our own context that we weren't able to talk about with anyone else before, except maybe our siblings. In my case, I'm one of 6 from an Irish American mother, Black American father, from the Boston area, heavily Irish context, Catholic born and raised, as were almost all of the families around us growing up. But in the 70s and 80s, that wasn't acknowledgeable in the places that I lived because of the legacy of tension and antagonism around race, particularly among Blacks and Irish in Boston. And so that creates a certain kind of a way in which you have to learn as an individual to kind of navigate and think about why it is that you can't be both Black and Irish outside of your family, at least. Part of what's been really interesting in the last 2 years, working closely with Miriam, we just had a really, really wonderful conference in November, exploring these issues. Has been, and I'm in some ways just echoing what Miriam just said, has been to really be able to listen to the variety of ways that people are speaking about their relationship to being both Black and Irish, the ways it's been possible and impossible, and what it means to them in a moment of great change, both here and in Ireland. So I'll just leave it there.
Mentioned the title of your book was?
My book is called Making Multiracial State, Family, and Market in the Redrawing of the Color Line, and that was by Stanford Press. I've written other articles that deal with the production of notions of mixedness through advertisements, through changes in census classification. I'm working on a longer piece now, How the Irish Became Black, looking at this sociologically, how it is that many people have Irish ancestors, but of African descent, but don't really have a language sometimes to speak about that. Yeah, so.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. So then maybe we can go over to Dedria Humphries. I had the great pleasure of engaging. Dedria actually did both a private contribution to the Black, Brown and Green and one-on-one interview, which we did by phone, actually, because of her location in Michigan. And then, well, it wasn't coincidentally, because I knew about her from a book that she had written. And maybe if I can hand over, Dedria is going to tell us much more eloquently than I about this whole project, and just to say how great it is to be on with you today, and lovely to see you, Dedria.
Well, thank you so much, Miriam. It's great to see you. Multicultural, multi-ethnic program. My impression of you, Lenny, was cemented when we were on that same program from Miriam's program, Black Voices, and you are just always so full of new information and presented in a way that's very interesting and engaging. So I thank you again for that. Today was great. And so it was good to see you, Miriam. And I have enjoyed being associated with your program at New York University, Glucksmith Ireland House. You know, you two lead the way in welcoming the African diaspora branch of the Irish tree. And it is interesting for me because all I ever thought I was African American, right? Even though my great grandmother, my mother's mother's mother, she was sitting right among us, and she was obviously a white woman. At least that's the way we thought of her. When I started researching my book, Mother of Orphans, The True and Curious Story of Irish Alice, a Colored Man's Widow, I did think of her as white, but boy, did I learn a lot about the Irish that we did not know about their history. And she was sitting right there. We just never talked about this, never. Silences. I'm from Detroit, and we're known as a people who are grateful to live in the present. The present brought so many rewards and benefits that, well, why deal with the past? And Detroit is famous for tearing down historic buildings, not preserving them, which grieves me now. But it's not like New York, I can tell you that, or Savannah. So we're people who live in the moment. So I was Black or colored or African American or Negro or whatever the term for the decade was to describe a people with African look, be it skin color, hair texture or hairstyle, broad features or dialect. You know, our term changed. We've been African American here for a while and Black, and I like that just fine. The path of me writing a book connecting my Black and Irish families did not start with an interest in genealogy or history. You know, I'm one of 13 children, and I have plenty enough family surrounding me in my life. I had no interest in tracking down a horde of new relatives, living or dead. I was just trying to find a story to explain some things in our lives, chiefly why my grandmother ended up in an orphanage when she was 11 years old. And she was put there by her mother, an Irish American woman. Now, as I said, I was born in Detroit, as was my mother. My father was a police officer, as was my mother's father. There are many parallels, and Lenny, you pointed this out earlier, how many parallels there are between the two groups. And there are many parallels between my mother and I, but one thing that was distinctive about me is that I was one of her 13 children, and all of us went to college. Education was a major value in our family. And it was similar to the street that we lived on with Black people. You know, I am Black. You know, somebody asked me that on my New York appearance. How do you identify? I'm a Black woman. So, but our family with 13 kids all going to school, you know, it just was such an impression on our neighbors. All my siblings and I attended the Detroit Public Schools. I attended Wayne State University in Detroit, one of the 3 siblings who did. I earned 2 degrees in English literature, a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. Except for one of us, the rest of my sisters and brothers attended Big Ten schools, public universities, including the University of Iowa, the University of Minnesota, Michigan State University. 5 of my siblings graduated from the Ann Arbor campus of the University of Michigan, and you know about them, right? And the affirmative action lawsuit. We kind of predated that, we're all baby boomers, but they felt, you know, like they weren't wanted, but they persisted. Now there's a theme here, and it is one explored in my book, Mother of Orphans, the true and curious story of Irish Alice, the colored man's widow. The theme is education, and particularly the education of women and the impact of their schooling on their children. A point my book makes is that for our family, this interest in education comes from my maternal great-grandmother, Irish Alice. My research showed that her family's pursuit of education was driven by the almost 1,000 years of conflict between the Irish and the English, with the Irish goal of preserving its culture. My book research took almost 20 years. Along the way, I shared my work mostly with my husband in the kitchen. My husband brought a perspective steeped in African-American and Native American and male culture. We argued many of my suppositions. Were they plausible? There was still much missing in my research, but that could never be recovered. Particularly, you know, how families lived. How did mixed race families live? People couldn't even imagine that there was such a thing as an Irish or white woman and a colored man living together, having a family, a house on the street, and they weren't being burned out every night. This was inconceivable to people at the turn of the 20th century. You know, but enough information emerged from our family records and official records. If there was any upside to my grandma being in an orphanage, it was that there were records that were kept on her and her sister and brother. And the history of Irish women, that I had enough to figure it out. At least I thought I did, enough to have a theory. So my husband and I, our biggest argument was whether the breakup of a family was worth educating a daughter. My book says it was. My grandma was Pauline Lucy Johnson. Her mother put her in the Clark County Children's Home in Springfield, Ohio in 1913. Pauline was nicknamed Polly. So that shows you the Irish right there. She was 11 years old and in the 5th grade. My research says the breakup was so Polly could go to school beyond the 5th grade and not become a nursemaid to her baby sister, who was almost 3 years old. Their father had died in 1912. Now this is where it's just strictly a woman's issue, because as long as John Henry Johnson, my grandma's father, as long as he lived, they were fine. He worked with horses, which was the attraction between him and his wife, Alice. But as soon as he died, even though he had, you know, saved some money, because he also gambled, he was a sporting man, their life got much harder. And the primary thing was childcare, just straight up, just like it is today. During the pandemic, you know, almost 1 million women left the workforce because they didn't have anybody to care for their children. Well, that was a problem more than 100 years ago too. And so who was going to watch this baby? And generally that's been girls' work. And Polly was just about the right age. So her mother put them all in the orphanage. It was my supposition. We know they were in the orphanage. It was just a question of why. And as a result of them being in the orphanage, my grandma got to go to school. She continued her schooling. And she graduated from high school in 1920. From there, she enjoyed a traditional woman's life of marriage and family. But her children and grandchildren, including me, all furthered our family's educational achievements. Perhaps the greatest goal of the value of schooling in our family for a woman was my late sister, Paula. She was one of my siblings who graduated from the University of Michigan. She was elected judge of the 36th District Court in Detroit at age 32 years. The Honorable Paula G. Humphries sat on the bench for nearly 30 years, and she was a good judge. With my 2 English degrees, and I also had some success, I've worked at occupations that learned literary people work at. I've been a journalist, an editor, a professor, a publisher, and an author. Education of girls was an Irish value, and it has become a value for African Americans because as a community, we understand that freedom from slavery awaited those who went to school, who became literate, though the law barred us from learning to read and write. There were so many benefits from becoming educated for Black people. And education is how my Black community comes and holds together. And I think that's our bond, at least my family's bond with our Irish family. Thanks.
Wonderful, wonderful book. Mine is all marked up. My sisters have tried to steal it several times, but I said, you got to get your, oh no, my sister, you got to get your own.
Thank you, Lenny.
Thanks, Dedria. It's so great to be refreshed of the wonderful story of the book. As Letty said, it's a great read. What Dedria does is tracks through generations the stories, including yourself, right? You're there in the latter part of it, and just a really interesting exploration around and using, you know, the source material. You did so much historical research, Dedria, to try and, you know, piece together as best we ever can with historical documents what was the rationale or context in which Irish Alice so, you know, gives up her children in that way, and how you reflect on it in terms of its impact down through the generations. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for bringing a Midwestern perspective. Is that fair enough to say, a Detroit perspective?
Yep, exactly.
And we're going to move from Detroit to Dublin. Now, we didn't plan it that way, but that just worked out. That worked out well. Someone who is also a great friend, Grace Odumosu, who is someone who contributed to the Black, Brown and Green Voices series as well. I will let Grace talk about herself, and it's wonderful to have her on with us this evening. Grace, thank you for being here, and please tell us a little bit about your work and your interventions in this space.
Miriam, thank you. And wow, what a great room, virtual room to be in, but isn't it great that we get to be in the room together, even though I'm here in Dublin and you guys are elsewhere. It's the value of Zoom. So I am, as Miriam said, from Dublin. I am mixed race, biracial. I'm still struggling with the correct wording for myself and how I self-identify, but I'll get there. I have had a very strange and interesting upbringing. I'm the entirety of my youth, I was pretty much the only, I mean, I am one of 4 siblings, so I have 2 sisters and a brother, but we were the only brown people that we knew. And so we kind of, you know, we lived in a white world. We lived in white Ireland, and I always wanted or tried to be as white as I could be, because that was what was normal. And to be this and to have this was not normal or accepted. Now, I'm not going to go into, like, I didn't have, you know, there wasn't any mad, crazy, terrible stories. I had a great life. Like, I enjoyed living, and my friends were wonderful, but all of my friends were white. None of them were like me. I used to, like, iron my hair to try and make it straight. I used to wear, my mom is white, so I used to wear, like, her makeup to try and pale myself out, almost the opposite of what you were talking about earlier, Lenny, and the blackface. And then even in a more bizarre twist of things, in my teenage years, you know, all my friends, it was really big here to wear fake tan, but like orange fake tan. And so this one over here, who didn't like her brown skin, would plop on this orange fake tan in order to kind of have the same hue of orange as the rest of my friends. So that's a little bit about my youth. And then I eventually moved over to the States, and I lived in Chicago for 6 years. And what a wonderful experience that was, because I could walk down the street and see 10 people who were the same shade as me or had similar hair as me, and I could connect with these other humans who mirrored me almost, until I spoke and the big Irish accent came out, and then it was like, huh? I got a lot of that my entire life, where people were just like, oh, what? Then also experienced in America, in Irish spaces, the not actually being Irish, or not being accepted as being Irish in those spaces. So that was definitely interesting and difficult to deal with. I often had to pull out my passport to prove to people that I was actually Irish. But I was happy enough to do that, because I am Irish, and that would be the first way that I would identify as being Irish. Actually, I'm connected with an organization in the UK called I Am Irish, and it's all about bringing mixed race, biracial Irish people together and telling the world that, yes, we're brown, but we're Irish. That's the first thing that you should know about us, is that we're Irish. So bringing it to now, I haven't written any books or anything yet. But there's definitely a lot of ideas rolling around in my brain. But where I'm at right now is in entertainment. So I'm back in Ireland, and I realized that, Ireland is opening up, and Ireland is understanding that Irish people can be brown, and Irish people are more than just, the general, what we think of as being Irish. And so I decided to come back to, I guess, try and pave my way. Slight rewind, I'm an actor. I started acting when I was about 4. Couldn't really do anything. I studied acting here in Ireland, and the only roles I ever got called in for were the roles of a slave or a role of a refugee, but never a role of an Irish person. And for those roles that I got called in for, I wasn't dark enough. So I wasn't dark enough to play Black, but not light enough to play Irish. So when I went to the States, I did find a completely different experience, to where I connected with other theatre makers who were just happy to create. And it wasn't about whether or not you were Irish, or whether you're American, or whether you were Black, or whether you were mixed. It was just about characters and about creating. So I kind of decided when all this kind of started to open up and everyone started having these conversations about being Irish and mixed and Black and all of these different things, I figured, okay, I'm going to go home and I'm going to start creating there, because it's so important now that people are talking about it, that we, you know, don't let this fade, or that it's not just a, okay, we'll tick a box because it's popular right now. We'll actually, you know, make some changes. So where I'm at the moment is I'm working on children's entertainment, I guess you could call it. But it's about educating the youth of Ireland so that hopefully they don't become this, oh, you're not actually Irish, or they don't become these people who say, oh, but where are you really from? And you know, our kids can say, oh, I'm from Ireland, and people will just be like, oh, cool. Bit of a roundabout way of introducing myself, but I'm glad to be in the space, and thank you.
Thank you, Grace. And historically, you've articulated your voice so well in your acting work. The books will come, and the books aren't the most important thing anyway, but you're far more creative than the rest of us. I've seen some of your work, and hopefully people on here will get to see some of it as well very soon. Thanks, Grace, for that. Lovely to see you in this space as well. So Lenny, I guess now we've a sense of who everybody is, and maybe we might transition to the kind of second portion of this segment of our webinar. Maybe if maybe I could just throw out the question of how, because we're on the eve of what I call the high holy day, with a bit tongue in cheek, tomorrow of St. Patrick's Day, and a day in which Irishness can have different meanings. You know, it's not celebrated in the US in the exact same way that it would have been celebrated in Ireland, for example, historically, etc., etc. But how do you, Kim, Grace, Dedria, how do you navigate, or how do you celebrate or not St. Patrick's Day, bringing to the table your sensibilities of identity and Irishness as you've kind of described them? Does anyone want to jump in on that one?
I can. Yeah, you know, as I mentioned, growing up in the Boston area, St. Patrick's Day is a huge holiday. And it's funny, I've said this before, but it was true. As a kid, it was the day I would feel the least Irish. Because it was, in some ways, the holiday, as Lenny points out, where everybody's Irish. And therefore, it seemed, at least as a child, like this is actually the day where everyone's going to question my Irishness more frontally than they usually do. Why are you wearing green? You know, in an odd way, even though everyone's supposed to be wearing green where we're from. But yet, you know, it was always a fun thing as well, because, you know, in our area, it was corned beef and cabbage. It was soda bread. It was tea, like a very Irish American sort of thing, where my grandmother and my mother would, you know, always make that part of the celebration. But as I sort of got older, I felt a little bit of distance from it for the reasons I just suggested, where the reduction of Irishness also to drunkenness seemed to me to be obnoxious and not really what it seemed to me being Irish was about. Revelry, sure. But it seems to me like when I step back and think about why St. Patrick's Day is so popular here, it's not really because there's so many Irish people or people of Irish descent here. It's that it seems, it's to me like it's a secular Mardi Gras for the rest of us. It's a kind of, it's a holiday that demands nothing from you. You don't have to go to mass. You don't have to do penance of any kind. It's just fun. And in that way, I've never let go of it, even as I felt a little bit alienated from it. And the older I get, the more I appreciate the memories that it has for me.
Question, Kim, do your kids celebrate it at all, or?
No, they don't really. They, yeah, it's an interesting thing. It's almost like, I think it's part because we've become such a mobile society. My kids, Boston's different than it used to be. It's not as heavily Irish identified, and their world is different than mine was in that regard. So.
Thanks, Kim, for that. Dedria, do you want to come in there, or?
Can I say something?
Oh yeah, sorry, Grace. Yeah, apologies. Yeah,
that's okay. It's funny that you said that Kim said that about it's the day that she feels least Irish. So when I was younger, you know, my mom would take us to the parade in town. We'd do all the Irish stuff. When I got to teenage years, we'd go to the big party on Cayley in town. But you know, there hasn't been a big celebration for the last 2 years. So it's and in the last 2 years has kind of been my time where I have, you know, accepted, and I put it to the front that I am both Irish and Nigerian, and I am both of those things, and I'm like so proud of it, versus, you know, trying to be one or trying to be the other. I'm both. But when I was in the States, when I was, you know, really into my Nigerian Blackness, it was actually when I felt most Irish, if that makes sense, in that I had less people questioning my Irishness, because like you said, Kim, everybody is Irish in the States on around the world on St. Patrick's Day. And so I always, like, the 6 years that I spent in the States, the 6th St. Patrick's Day was always so amazing. I had so much fun. I wore green. I was so Irish, and nobody like questioned that, because everyone was Irish, and I just had so much fun. It was such a great experience for me, those 6 years of experiencing American Irishness, St. Patrick's Day celebrations.
Thanks for sharing, Grace. That's fascinating.
I can contribute to that. So I definitely understand the fun aspect, Kim, because that's what St. Patrick's Day is for Americans. And for our family, I think it was easier to come to our Irish heritage through the holiday and the fun, because we're an event family. All our parties are around Christmas, Easter, birthdays. As you can imagine, we had at least one a month. At least some months have more, and we still get together like that. There's a holiday coming. Where's the party? Whereas when I approached it strictly from oh, look at this information I found out, that was kind of too threatening, because families have their narratives, their master narratives, like any society or any community. And if it's being threatened in some way, there's going to be pushback on that. I remember showing my mother some documents from the orphanage, and a challenge. I didn't see it as a challenge, but it turned out to be a challenge that, you know, what you said about this way back in the day, why she was in the orphanage, she said it was racism. I said, I'm not sure if that was the case. She looked at the census and all this information I collected, and she said, maybe. Just like that, maybe. And so when we started to embrace, Kim and Grace also said this about when St. Patrick's Day came up, you know, was like, do you celebrate that? And when I was in college, I mean, it's a total college holiday here in the Midwest. But when I was in college, we did not. I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta, Black Greek organization, and it just wasn't a thing. So, but and to get my family on board, you know, we just started doing this, going to Detroit's Corktown. And then my mother said, you know, when my grandma would come to town, because Alice, Irish Alice, she visited a couple of 3 times a year. That's where she went. She stayed with them, but she would go and socialize in Corktown. And so my mother started talking more about what it was like when she was a child, because her Irish grandma was the only grandparent that she had. And she was very dear to her. And I don't think she felt safe really talking about that as you know, we became, the family was obviously Black. We embraced that, and it was almost like it was this blip on the screen, and then, okay, we're all Black, you know? So fun was the way to do that.
Miriam.
Yeah, that's really, sorry.
No, ma'am, go ahead.
No, something that Dedria was saying reminds me of, you know, the broader context for me. Yeah, as a Black mixed race woman, yes, my Irishness was in some ways a family centered and personal. So in a college context, like none of my friends were celebrating St. Patrick's Day.
Right.
You know, and even, you know, my Black friends, to do so was in some ways seen as like suspect, or they had a kind of resistance to it precisely because of the association with Irishness and racism.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it's not a kind of thing, at least in the context that I was in, where I felt like I could freely embrace this thing, even as it is part of my cultural heritage and experience. It's the kind of thing that, yeah, nobody wants to hear about this.
Right.
I want to ask you ladies, if I could ask one more question before we move forward. And that is, so the foreground, Kim, is St. Patrick's Day. Yeah. The landscape is Women's Month. Yeah. And the loom is that you're all 4 mothers. How do you negotiate your children through the Straits of Magellan, through the crises of race and culture that is so dominating democracy right now? And what do you want to say to mothers like you that after the confetti is swept up and the streets are cleaned and the bottles are collected and we carry away the notions and potions of St. Patrick, and you're going on as guides and nurturers of these 21st children in a world that's trying to go backwards to the 19th century, Kim? How are you gonna, what is the map, dear sisters, for Friday morning, and what is the advice for mothers like you? Thank you. Grace, could I ask you to go next? And also, would you share with our folks a bit about the story you told me about taking your child out on the playground in Chicago? What
Oh, which bit?
yeah,
So the
do
first thing
tell
I
people
want to
about.
say is that I teach my son is 4. And so I teach him. That's the first thing, he's already, like I said, I'm into creating stuff for children. So I involve him in my creative process, and we create videos together. We record ourselves reading stories about Black history, about Frederick Douglass, about lots of different things, just to open his mind up to make sure that he has a bigger idea of what it means to be Irish, and that he is Irish, and that his mom is Irish too. Now, I'm in a bit of a different boat than Miriam, in that my son is quite white passing, if that's the correct phrase to say. He's got very pale skin, and he's got bright blue eyes, and a blonde afro, actually, but when he was younger it was kind of more like soft blonde curls. Now it's gone quite afro-y, which is wonderful, and he actually looks like me. I'm gonna say it, he looks like his mother. I am a single mother, so it's just me and him. But if the story that I think you want me to talk about, or that you're bringing up, it's not actually a story that just has happened once, but happens often, and that is that, and stop me if I'm telling the wrong story, and also
No,
remind me.
you're exactly on the right track there.
Okay, so when I go out with my child, people don't think he's my child. They think I'm his nanny. They think I'm the babysitter. Or if I'm with somebody who is white, they think immediately that he is their child. It doesn't matter if they're tall and dark black hair and white skin. They are, my son is quite small, in stature, but it's instantly, he could never be mine purely based on the skin tone or the melanin in his skin. And it happens all the time. It's not, like I said, it's not just it happened to me one time when brought him to a playground in Chicago. It's happened to me when I went away on vacation. He was small. He was like 6 months, and I went with a white friend of mine to Spain, and every person there was the person I went with. She had gone there often. They were like, "Oh my God, I didn't know you had a baby," to her, and she was like, "Oh no, I didn't have a baby. Like, I was here like 4 months ago. You would have known if I had a baby. No, it's her baby. Like, that's her." And literally, you just get this look of, and the jaw open, and people really just trying to figure out like how. And I think it's interesting because it's reflected in the stories that my mom would tell me about when she would go out with us when we were little, and how people used to think either she had adopted us, that and she used to get those like, "Oh, you're very good taking in the black kids from Africa, like you're very good," or that she was the babysitter. And people constantly wanting to questioning. They're constantly questioning me about parenting this young human, and they constantly questioned her about parenting us. And so again, not to keep bringing it back, but it is like, it's all circular, isn't it? What I'm trying to do now is to educate parents, children, white moms of mixed children, white moms of white children, mixed children, all of them, to not question, because it's great to question. It's great. We all need to, like, you know, question and understand and learn, but it's never just like a question and then I give an answer. It's almost like an interrogation. And so I'm trying to squash that by reading these stories, by being this Black, mixed race, brown-skinned Irish human, reading stories and just being me and accepting me and telling my story and telling other people's stories to children.
Great. I'm going to ask if Dedria and Kimberly will give us their parting shots, and I'm going to also ask our colleagues who have joined us viewing, if you can indulge us. We'll be going about 15 minutes over because I really want Frederick to close this loop about confronting history and making history real and live, and removing the sepia tone as we work hard to reclaim, reconnect, reconvene. So ladies, your parting advice to sisters across the world?
Well, I will just say briefly that, you know, raising kids is humbling because, you know, the context that you may have grown up in is likely not the same one that they face, and being attuned to that to the extent that you can becomes really important. So I really straddled and sometimes struggled to sort of give them what I thought that they needed as they're Black children. I have a daughter and 2 sons, but they're all very light-skinned for some reason. Not what I would have expected, actually, given their father. And so, you know, we kind of raised them, my husband's Jamaican, with what we were brought up with, which is like, you must recognize what it means to be Black in this society. And you must, in some ways, defend it, because you'll be challenged, you'll be denigrated, and you must find an inner resource to be proud of that. And yet, I naively thought my children would have it sort of easier than I did because they had 2 Black parents. That didn't turn out to be the case, partly because of the way that they look, but also because the context they're in, they see themselves as Black mixed race people in a way that I didn't think they would. And so some of the same things I had to navigate, they've also had to navigate. Where do I fit in? I'm not quite like the other kids. They don't, you know, accept me because of the way I look, or they expect me to be a certain way that I'm not. You know, part of these are challenges of growing up, and part of these are challenges of race. So just be attentive and acknowledge what context they're in would be my advice.
Thank you.
I have to agree with Kim on that, is that their reality is so different from ours. The computer is mostly responsible for that. But, you know, for us, you heard me describe my upbringing in Detroit, and now we live in like a college town. So it's very different. And we live, not Irish, because Irish are white people now, but we live white. And, but sometimes, I mean, because of what I do, you know, I work with mostly white people. And then, you know, our neighborhood is mostly white people. And then because of my church, I'm Episcopalian, whereas in Detroit, it was a Black church. There aren't enough Black Episcopalians here to have a church. So, you know, my church is mostly white, very cool people, but, you know, mostly white. But the difference is perspective, right? So I understand that, and I understand that we raise them in a mostly white environment, but sometimes socially, when I see like my daughter who's brown like her father, when I see her with a bunch of white people, I think, what is she doing there? You know, it just doesn't compute with me, because that isn't, those aren't the eyes that I see her with. I see her with Black eyes. And in the house, we are Black, but when we go out on the street, we're, you know, part of this great mixed up crowd, and that's mostly white. And you can see it's still very like complicated even for me. And we do try to remind them of that. My son is, he's a writer as well. And I remember on the election of Barack Obama as the president, he said, he wrote in this editorial for the college newspaper, he said, you know, when Barack Obama got elected last week, he said, I thought it was a good thing, but my parents thought it was a miracle. You know, so it's just the way that they view the world and we view the world. And, you know, you have to be open to their way and see the world from their point of view. Remind them of where we come from, but you know, they're going forward, even if forward is, you know, kind of rolling back.
Well, it's two important things you said. One is that it's not a wheel and it's not a spiral, it's a pendulum. So it moves backwards as it moves forward too. And we are in what the Hindus call the Kali Yuga, falling backwards into darkness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I wanted to ask you ladies, you know, who see in the night and see in the dark, how we might navigate tomorrow and for all the tomorrows, the stereotype of St. Patrick Day with the reality of preparing a world for mixed race, multicultural children and their communities, their churches, their schools. It's a dynamic conversation, ladies, and I would really thank you all so much, and Miriam, so much
Lenny,
for bringing this.
Yeah, Lenny, can I just say one thing, just ending on St. Patrick? It's a really, like, obviously important because of tomorrow, but the symbolism and the impact that this holiday has globally is immense. And, you know, there is scope in that to really push out the boat and how we define Irishness as we look forward in a really global setting, just because it's celebrated so widely by so many different people. And in that way, you know, we have to kind of work hard and be optimistic and imaginative about how this day, when this tiny little rainy island in the Atlantic is celebrated, how that symbolism and global reach can be used in a way that services reimagining the richness of the Irish experience. I just wanted to interject with that.
No, that is perfect. And Miriam, you know, you and I have had long conversations about William Henry Lane, Master Juba, whom I followed. Literally, my first trip to Ireland was to follow his tour, to go every place that he had danced. He was born in Providence, Rhode Island, a freedman. He went at age 14 to dance in the taverns in the Five Corners Irish section of town. And as a little Black boy, you had to be damn good to get out of an Irish bar, you know, with your life in 1848. You had to dance.
Wow.
I was intrigued by meeting Frederick Jones and hearing about the work he was doing in his community. I was intrigued because his story was so much like our story of trying to reclaim the old 8th Ward that's not there. And I wanted to ask him, Miriam, in a kind of ABA. A is recovering and reclaiming vanished communities. B is people who are perpetrating those cultures in the world through the vision of mothers. And A is back to a restoration project again. And I love to introduce you to the thought and the work of Frederick Jones.
Thank you for having me, Lenny. And I appreciate all these stories I've heard about identification, right? And both that public and private self. I want to talk about the work I've been doing in Providence. But at first I'd like to talk about how I sort of got there with my own practice. It's a little bit of an artistic venture. I'm very thankful to my friend and brother, Donald King, who invited me to Providence to take part in this project. This project is sort of put by the Providence Cultural Equity Initiative and Roger Williams. It's part of the unending work of Ray Watson, who is just constantly working to uncover Black and Indigenous histories and heritage in Providence. The history itself is not necessarily my history, so I wanted to tread on it carefully, although there are many parallels to my own personal history. Many of these things that have already been talked about identification, about location, about migration. And the history itself is compiled in A Matter of Truth, which was collected by the Mayor's African American Ambassador Group. It's called The Struggle for African Heritage and Indigenous Peoples' Equal Rights. So I think I'll just start with my slideshow. So mapping through history. I came to mapping as Lenny was talking about, to negotiate and to navigate, but also this idea of wonder and wandering, because as has been shared in these stories, it's a complicated history and it's a complicated present that has been formed by these histories. Now, I've spent a lot of time in Hamburg, Germany, and I'm an immigrant there, and just trying to figure out, where do I belong? I use mapping to sort of locate myself. And we have these images, right? Google Maps, right? This is something that we all recognize as a way of navigating place. But these images, this notion of location and this notion, both geographically and historically, are often complicated. And I think it's important, right, in this act of navigating and identifying, to find our own language. And so I started trying to figure out ways of locating myself in spaces. And we can see on the left, I did a similar image to that map, just from memory and location, to find myself in Hamburg. And as well as, I'm an artist, so finding my way from my home to my studio in the image on the right. Navigating, mapping is not just a way of locating, but also a way of sharing. And so I tried to find ways of taking that language, using words, using lines to bring something across, to communicate some sort of way of getting from one place to another, right? So this was a way for me to find myself, of course, but also a way for me to share that. And I brought this back with me to Allentown, Pennsylvania, where I reside now. Finding my way from work, finding and locating my favorite walks, but really sort of finding myself, finding how my history placed me where I was at that moment. Now, of course, right, modern technology, we were always sort of surrounded by different ways of navigating, locating, and being located. This is an app, a walking app. showing 3 different walks that I've made, right? A very simple way of sort of locating oneself in space according to corporate guidelines. And, you know, through this act, and of course through the pandemic, which sort of shifted the way I do art as well as the way I enter the classroom, with my friend and brother, Nestor Hill, I started exchanging these walks. He's located in Easton, Pennsylvania, and I at the time was in Hamburg, Germany. We would send these pictures, we would send maps, we would send drawings back and forth, and we would take walks together even though we were apart. On the right, you can see little over a WhatsApp, right? A little application for exchanging conversations. We could actually exchange these conversations that they set in real time, take a walk together. This is something I also started doing with my students. Now, of course, we can see how complicated this walk becomes when you have 15 people giving directions. Now, this idea of mapping and locating myself in space, I say I started this because I was trying to identify myself, locate myself. And so I realized in this creating of maps and taking walks that at night, I would find myself walking through a city, walking outside of a city. And here, the image on the left is Allentown, but the image on the right is a walk I took in my dreams. These 2 images, you know, some more realistic than others, right? On the left, I walk along the hills, and on the right, I even come in here above the water and walk then onto the land, right? This sort of fantasy, this imagination, and being able to imagine, right, not only where we could be, but where we are. Now, having lived in Germany and also dealing with these same sort of ideas that basically form what American identity is, right? The transatlantic slave trade. Locating myself here in the left in Mount Carmel, South Carolina. And how does these sort of journeys go from there, right? Also to Detroit, to Alabama, you know, the story of Maroons being brought back to South Carolina, accepted into the plantation. It is a funny place, the plantation. And I say is, it still is, and it's still very much alive. Or on the right, you know, that's sort of my in-between space in the Atlantic. Of course, living here with the ancestry that comes and mixes here in the United States, but also having lived as an immigrant in Europe, right? And how does that mixed space create a new identity for myself? People often ask, what kind of accent do you have? And I don't know, it's a mix of the places I've lived, I assume. So I was invited to join this project in Providence, and there are 4 neighborhoods that we sort of chose to focus on. Fox Point, which is on the right, Lippet Hill, which is up to the north. Right there by the Rhode Island Hospital is the Upper South Providence, and off to the left is West Elmwood. Now, something brought all of these areas together, and that was these acts of migration. The funny thing about these histories is that they're not really hidden. Dedria, you said something, you said not talked about. It's more like they're not talked about because we can see them. right? We can look at the map of Providence. We can see the way this highway rips through the town, cutting neighborhoods in half, cutting neighborhoods off from the seaport, from occupations. So here's an image of Upper South Providence in 1952 and in 2020. And you can see how this sort of, of course, it's a little hazy on the side because of industry, I assume, but it's filled with houses. And I think Upper South Providence is sort of exemplary because these other three neighborhoods, this process of pushing families out of their homes started earlier. And they were all sort of pushed to Upper South Providence. But then Upper South Providence was cut off from both the harbor and from downtown through the building of highways and through the building of the hospital. And I was trying to figure out how I could use this mapping work of mine to locate this history that is not hidden at all, but right there in front of us, right? How do you visualize this violence that we walk through every day? You know, of course, line, color, expression, and pattern. You know, this is Mashog Pond, or the West Elmwood neighborhood. And we can see how these highways came in, and where I placed that pattern, that used to be families. And, you know, in the 1950s and 60s, families without resources or without political clout. And in Providence, predominantly African-American and indigenous families did not have the power or the wealth to hold on to their properties. And so right here, West Elmwood was turned into an industrial park, and the inhabitants moved outside of Providence or to Upper South Providence. Or if I go north up to Lippet Hill, right, we can see North Main Street, Doyle Avenue, and Olney Street. To the left, we see the highway. Now, this used to be a huge economic center for the Providence African-American community. You know, there's the schools, those were there. If we look at this next one, we see on the left is 1952, and just 10 years later, we have 1962, right? So we have all these houses, and, you know, along Main Street, businesses that were just raised to build a shopping mall. Of course, they had already been cut off from the larger neighborhood through the building of that highway. Now, so trying to think about how this sort of happens, how does this, it's almost like a bleeding out or an incision, a cutting that happens to these places. And I was trying to locate, you know, of course, the violence, the disruption, and just what, like all these stories about identification that I heard today, we're talking about this public and private self, right? Every one of these, you know, when we look at a map, when we look at Google Maps, right, we have blocks, we have houses, you know, every one of those houses is a family, right? Or a collection of families. And, you know, what makes a community? It's people. Well, it's also place. And the thing is, you know, this Providence might not literally be my history, right? But it's parallel And something Grace said was, about her story, it's not just once, but often. There's patterns that keep on repeating themselves. And so I started thinking about this map and how do we bring these images together, right? Into a fabric, a weaving, right? What is community? A weaving. And I was working with different patterns. Here's another one. This notion of a tile or a piece of a quilt, right? Because the quilt, here are two iterations of that quilting pattern of the Lippet Hill quilt, right? The quilt has its own sort of aesthetic, its own history, this sort of bridging that domestic, that private, and that public self. Of course, what is the domestic? Or here's an example of tile work, right? Like the kitchen, right? When I talk about the domestic, when I talk about these homes lost, I'm talking about, of course, craft, but also culture, living culture, right? Because culture is not something that we lock up in a museum. Culture is something that's exchanged between people, right? It is food, it is language. It is the domestic put into the public. It's a stitching together, right? Trying to mimic these stitching, this sewing, this binding together. Because, right, this binding is what holds culture together. It's this communication. That's what community is. Not just place, but also place. Not just people, but very much people. At Fox Point, we see this highway just cutting that neighborhood off from the water. It's right, but it's not unique. It's repetitive, repetition. And it's so obvious. These are histories that are not hidden, but they're histories that are not talked about. And that's that structure. These structures, to talk about making a doorway or a portal to the past, a portal to not uncover, but to see with our eyes that are open, right? And to be able to take that on and to make a new future, to step through that portal. Because, right, maps and history are visible, very visible, almost too visible. And I know myself, sometimes I'm afraid to look. But I appreciate y'all letting me share what I've been up to. Thank you.
It's brilliant work. Brilliant, 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 brilliant work. Brilliant work. Where are you in the development of public meetings, civic dialogues, and how can we follow this work as you restitch these communities lost but not forgotten, vanished but still resonant in our? How can we follow this work and its development?
Well, the Matter of Truth is online, and the Ray Watson has been working hard in Providence, and at this moment we're getting ready to go public with that project, where we're looking to create a memorial and as well as a interactive historical Yeah, what's the word? Yeah, portal. Now I'll have to get back to you on when that does go public.
Well, please
it's
do.
very much in the process right now.
Please do, because stitching it into our memory, we can't rebuild place. We can't restore place, but memory and the DNA, which is where I started with these two ships, that a new culture is built in the memory that reorganizes the DNA. I'm really very much excited. We're trying to find out, Miriam, if one of these communities was where Juba lived, since we don't know very much about him before he appears in New York's Five Corners. What possibilities did he bring with him, to that contest between Diamond and Juba? And it's been very, very rich. I always end every one of these sessions with my New Orleans thing. First, you make a roux, and then you put things into the roux. So this conversation today was to make that roux. And to chop up all those things. I asked each of my guests and each of you who have given us the honor of staying with us, is to add now to the roux of this conversation your own ingredients of thought, your own narratives, your own personal maps, your own swatches of cloth, either in your pockets or in the pockets of your memory, to help us put this crazy quilt together.
Lenny, I think Kim has her hand raised there.
Yes.
Oh, well, wanted to know how we can get in touch with Frederick. I was especially moved by, as we were discussing earlier, both of my parents are from Providence. And so the maps that you're showing are actually places I'm very familiar with, as well as the stories of urban renewal that displaced Black families, especially entire Cape Verdean communities, in the time that you're talking about. But I find it so evocative what you're doing, as someone who, I'm teaching a course on home economics. And it's a way to kind of think about the concept of home, our relationships to land, how they get disrupted, and have been disrupted because of class and racial kinds of divisions, and how we've lost a lot of knowledges about the home and creating space and producing for ourselves. And so your work is just such a lovely illustration that for my students. So I would love for them to be able to engage it. And I see you put it in the chat, because one of the things we're thinking about now is quilting.
Yes, and hidden in plain sight, Kim, is a really,
yes.
And only through the repetition of the pattern do we even begin to see.
Right.
It's not unique to my time. This is a pattern of
yeah, very excited for learning more about your stuff, Frederick. Thank you.
Please put the titles of your books, your projects, and your websites or emails in the chat for us. Thanks to our partners at the Dauphin County Libraries System, we will create the Thomas Morris Chester Research Center on African Americans and the vote. But the franchise is the glue that holds all these conversations together in our minds, and it is also a research place. They also make a YouTube of this, which all of our guests and all of our visitors today will be able to, in about 72 hours, get that YouTube link so that you can revisit this conversation and or reconnect with each other. I always—
Can we say happy St. Patrick's Day too, Lenny?
Yes, we can. Yes.
No,
yes,
you have to do that as our host.
I want you to reflect upon the meaning of the shamrock. You know, like, please reflect upon the meaning of the shamrock. I personally have a little trouble with St. Patrick's Day because while it embraces the joy for living, which Irish culture, just as music and dance embrace the joy of African and African American culture, it also perpetuates the worst stereotypes, just as that blackface does, you know. And how can we separate the joy of laughter, the thrill of dance and motion, the camaraderie, the joke, and not be caught forever in the hall of mirrors of the stereotypes. So that's why it's a kind of navigating St. Patrick's Day and coming out with your joy in place is what I wish you all well. But check out that shamrock. It's got a lot of meaning. And then go visit Yemaya or Oshun or any number of those people, and you will find threads of ritual. All blessings to you. All blessings.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
We
Thank
end
you
the
so
series.
much.
We're going to end the series in April with our final session, which is called John Brown in Pennsylvania, and it talks about the roots of three of the four full life figures of our monument: Francis Harper, William Howard Day, and T. Morris Chester, all studied at Oberlin under John Brown. You know, and of course we know about Frederick Douglass and John Brown here in Pennsylvania. So we'll end this series by streams of resistance, insurrection, agitation. So I hope you all come back. Look for the invitation from Ashley in the library. All blessings to you.
Okay.
Be well, be blessed.
Thank you.
Such fun. Thank you.